This is part 3 of the series of lectures relating to the influences on nutritional status. And if we have a look at our syllabus, the purpose of this lecture is to look specifically in detail at food sensitivities, and we're covering off food intolerances. And you should be able to describe the relationship between intolerances and food choices and their effect on health and dietary disorders. So having a look at this slide, which is the introduction to food intolerances, it's important to note that an intolerance is a type of food sensitivity. So if we go back to our umbrella, we know that food sensitivities are an umbrella term, and allergies are a type of food sensitivity, but so too are intolerances. And one of the key things that you need to be able to do is differentiate or to contrast between allergies and intolerances. So you really need to know the difference between an allergy and an intolerance. And there are 4 or 5 key differences that you should be able to remember, particularly if you get an exam question on it in your HSC. So a food intolerance is different from a food allergy in a number of ways. I'm going to highlight these throughout the presentation, and we also have a past paper question we're going to do at the end. However, 2 immediate ways or 2 very clear ways that they're different is that a food intolerance does not usually involve the immune system, okay? And the reason why is because antibodies are not released when a person has an intolerance. It is more of a digestive response, and it involves physical signs and symptoms rather than an immune response. So for an intolerance, antibodies are not released. Now, another important point is to note the part of the food that is actually being responded to with an intolerance. So the body is not actually responding to an individual protein when a person has a food intolerance, but the person is actually responding to a chemical or a group of chemicals that are found widely in a variety of foods, and they sometimes require a large amount to cause a reaction. So a food intolerance does not involve the immune system, it involves the digestive system, and it involves more physical responses rather than an immune response. And it is not a response to a protein in a food, but rather the response to a group of chemicals in food. And it therefore requires larger quantities of the chemical to be ingested for the reaction to occur. Also, it does take time for the symptoms to develop, and it will not be an immediate response. Also, it is not a life-threatening condition, and therefore it is not anaphylactic. So someone that has an intolerance does not have anaphylaxis, and it's not a life-threatening condition. So food intolerances are an individual's response to a specific chemical or combination of chemicals. It occurs when a person actually has difficulty digesting a part of a food, which is why the immune system isn't involved, but rather it triggers the digestive system and initiates a range of physical responses. So sometimes a food intolerance can be triggered by food chemicals, and these are the common groups of chemicals that can cause food intolerances. So the first group is salicylates. Now, these are groups of chemicals found in all plant foods. Many fruits, vegetables, spices, herbs, nuts, as well as tea and coffee can contain these chemicals. It's also used as an additive in food, and it's used in eucalyptus and peppermint flavored products. So think about things like eucalyptus drops or lollies or lozenges, and peppermint is found commonly in a lot of sweet foods. So peppermint and chocolate ice cream, or peppermint biscuits, or peppermint minty lollies, or even peppermint chewing gum. So people that have intolerances to salicylates really need to make sure that they're avoiding a range of different foods. Amines are another group of chemicals that a person is commonly intolerant to. Now, these are found commonly in cheeses, processed meats, beer, and wine. They're also found specifically in fruits and vegetables, and in particularly in bananas, tomatoes, and avocados, and they're also found in chocolate. Glutamate is the last group of chemicals, and glutamate is an amino acid, and it has a lot of, media exposure because of MSG, which is a form of glutamate, monosodium glutamate to be specific. Now, it's found naturally in plants and animals, and it does provide part of that savory flavor in foods like mushrooms and tomato products, as well as cheeses, soy sauce, and meat extracts like Vegemite. But as I've mentioned, it is used as an additive and a flavor enhancer in many snack foods and also Asian cooking. And it does produce some undesirable signs and symptoms if somebody has difficulty digesting MSG, which is a form of glutamate. So an individual who has a food intolerance will notice that the symptoms can appear shortly after eating, but not instantly. Or they can even take some time, several hours, to actually develop. And many of the symptoms can be very similar to that of a food allergy. A wide variety of symptoms, however, have been reported as a result of the food intolerance, which is why often it is quite difficult to determine if somebody has an intolerance, because there are so many different symptoms associated. So skin symptoms like hives, eczema, rashes and mouth ulcers, a blocked nose, sinus pain or asthma, abdominal pain like nausea, diarrhea, flatulence and constipation, headaches, lack of energy, dizziness, memory and concentration impairment, as well as in some severe circumstances, behavior and mood symptoms like depression, irritability and aggressive behavior. So how would somebody actually identify if they have a food intolerance? And then once it's identified, how would they manage it? Identification is far more complicated for an intolerance than it is for an allergy. And this is because it involves chemicals that are present in a wider range of foods. Now, this is really exemplified through lactose intolerance, which is a focus we're going to look at in a subsequent slide. But lactose intolerance is when a person has difficulty digesting the milk sugar lactose, which is found in milk. Now, this chemical is not only found in milk, it's found in anything that is made from milk. So we've got yogurt, ice cream, custard, skim milk powder, which can then be translated into products like instant coffee mixes, etc. So it is difficult to actually identify if somebody has an intolerance because the chemical of lactose is found in a wide range of different foods. And just like all intolerances, this is one of the challenges of actually working out if somebody has a food intolerance. Now, in the case of a food intolerance, the specific chemicals need to actually be isolated. And this is a challenging process. To do this, the individual is placed on a strict elimination diet. The elimination diet only allows a narrow selection of foods to be consumed. That is, those foods that don't contain high levels of any substances likely to cause reactions. They are very, very bland foods, and they are also low in flavorful food chemicals. We're going to have a look at what the foods are allowed, or the foods that are allowed on an elimination diet. So this list of foods is important. We're going to do a past paper question in relation to this later on. But meats, only lamb, veal and skinless poultry, so chicken that doesn't have the skin. Eggs are allowed. Fats like safflower and sunflower oils. The only vegetables allowed are lettuce, parsley and thickly peeled old potatoes. Only thickly peeled fresh ripe pears are allowed, or even pears that are in a syrup. The only cereals that are allowed are white rice and rice products, so things like rice cakes, as well as wheat and corn flour, arrowroot flour and potato flour. White sugar is allowed, and the beverages are only instant coffee, pear juice, mineral water and soda water. Now, it does take between 2 to 6 weeks for the intolerant symptoms to become less severe because the person would have not ingested any chemicals that are triggering that intolerance. Once all of the possible chemicals have been eliminated from the body, which does take 2 to 6 weeks, the chemicals that are suspected to be responsible for the symptoms are then reintroduced into the diet one by one. And this is what the food challenge is. If no effect is identified after 2 days, the next challenge is introduced. And this repeats until the person has those signs and symptoms that develop that would then isolate what chemical it is the individual is actually intolerant to. Now, long-term management of a food intolerance does not actually require complete avoidance of the chemicals that cause the problem, since the reaction usually depends upon how much is actually consumed. For example, if somebody has lactose intolerance, then they are still allowed to have milk and milk products, but they can't have more than 100 ml of milk a day, which is just under half a cup. So it is a small amount, but it is different to an allergy. A person who has an allergy cannot ingest any of the protein, even in the smallest quantity. However, if somebody has an intolerance, they still can tolerate small amounts of that food. Now, reducing the offending foods and establishing how much is safe is important, and this often varies from person to person. Managing a food intolerance can be more complicated than managing an allergy because a much wider range of foods will actually contain the specific chemical or the group of chemicals that causes the symptoms. Also, the chemicals can occur both naturally in foods and also as additives, which is another challenge of managing a food have intolerance. So as mentioned, we're going to have a look at lactose intolerance in more detail. Now, a lactose intolerance is not to be confused with a milk allergy. Okay, so it is not a milk allergy, it is an intolerance to a particular chemical in milk. A milk allergy is an immune system response to a milk protein, whereas lactose intolerance results when an individual has difficulty digesting lactose. So what is lactose? Lactose is the main carbohydrate or main sugar found in milk. It's also known as a milk sugar. Now, it is a disaccharide that is broken down into the gut or in the gut into monosaccharides. And this process requires an enzyme known as lactase. So lactase breaks down lactose in the small intestine into monosaccharides from disaccharides. Monosaccharides are simple sugars. Now, as you can see here through this image, which showcases what happens when somebody can break down lactose versus when somebody cannot break down lactose. Lactose is ingested through the diet, and you'll see that it is a disaccharide. Okay, so there are two sugar or saccharide molecules, glucose and galactose, and this is how lactose is formed. Now, when somebody ingests food that contains lactose, it does go to the small intestine. And when there is sufficient lactase, which is the enzyme that breaks down lactose, it is broken down into two simple sugars or monosaccharides known as glucose and galactose. And this is what happens when somebody does not have a lactose intolerance. However, when somebody does have lactose intolerance, it is due to the fact that they don't have enough of the enzyme lactase. And as a result, the disaccharide lactose cannot be broken down. What happens then is that the lactose will continue to travel until it passes into the colon, which is the lower part of the digestive tract. And unabsorbed lactose reaches the colon, causing a watery stool. This also can cause gas and abdominal cramping, which are some of the symptoms or the physical effects of somebody with lactose intolerance. 1 million Australians have some degree of lactose intolerance, suffering from discomfort, diarrhea, or flatulence if they have too much lactose. The majority of sufferers are of certain cultural descents, mainly Asian or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or of Mediterranean background. And the reason why is because these particular locations or geographical locations don't typically have access to milk and milk products, or they didn't throughout our history, which means that people have evolved from these cultures to not have high levels of lactase in their digestive system. So also, if somebody doesn't have lactose products for an extended period of time, eventually the lactase in the stomach, those levels of the enzyme will actually decrease if a person doesn't consume any lactose. Now, lactose is found naturally in a range of dairy foods in different amounts, but it's also used as an additive in processed foods. So it's really important that someone who has a lactose intolerance really manages their ingestion of lactose, and by having a look at the amount of lactose in different food products. So it's seen here that regular cow's milk, goat's milk, and reduced fat cow's milk, as well as evaporated milk, are really, really strong sources of lactose. So they really should be avoided or ingested in really controlled quantities. There are varieties of foods like lactose-reduced milk that have less lactose, and some types of cheese also have less lactose. So having regular cheese as opposed to ricotta cheese will help a person manage their symptoms. Children who have one family member with an allergic disease or an intolerance are 20 to 40% higher risk than developing an allergy than those that don't have hereditary links. So this here is really just to exemplify that there is some information to suggest that there is some genetic predisposition to developing an allergy or an intolerance. So in order to manage lactose intolerance, it is preferable to do the following. People need to choose dairy foods that are lower in lactose, as I've already mentioned. The amount of dairy food consumed in one sitting at one time should be limited. Therefore, spreading dairy food intake out over the day so that the gut receives very small amounts of lactose at a time is recommended. Consuming dairy foods as well with other meals and other foods rather than on an empty stomach so that the lactose is gradually decreased with the other foods is also another recommendation. So as mentioned, we are going to do a couple of these practice questions that relate to the content that we've covered in the past 3 lectures. So this is a very, very common HSC question, and we'll unpack this question together. So to begin, we're going to have a look at the verb in the question. So the question says to distinguish between an allergy and an intolerance. Now the word distinguish means to state the differences between. And because this question is out of 4 marks, we need to have more than just one difference. I would actually recommend that you have 4 differences between an allergy and an intolerance. Now, the subject-specific terminology that's in this question, and the syllabus links are the words allergy and intolerance. So to start with, I've just drawn up a little table to map some of the content to the question. So one of the key differences between an allergy and an intolerance is that an allergy is an immune system response that involves the release of antibodies to try and kill the particular protein in the food. Now, on the other hand, we can see that an intolerance is not an immune response. It is a physical response that involves the digestive system, so antibodies are not released. Now, the language that I've chosen to address the verb has been boxed in around the question. So you would need to use this language to address that verb distinguish, because it's language that you can show that you're using to show the difference between. So whereas, on the other hand, alternately, and unlike. These are terms that you need to be integrating into your response. So you could say an allergy is an immune response where antibodies are released to try and destroy the protein. Whereas, or on the other hand, an intolerance is not an immune response. It is a physical response involving the digestive system. So another difference between the two is that an allergy involves a reaction to a specific protein in a food, and I've included examples because these examples show knowledge and understanding, and it's really important that as a food tech student, you're always including examples in your response. So nuts, eggs, and soy are common proteins that are basically those allergens that can trigger an allergic reaction. So using that terminology of allergens would show more subject-specific terminology and content knowledge. So alternatively, an intolerance involves a reaction to a specific chemical or group of chemicals in food, and the example that I have given in this particular instance is lactose. So two other differences that I have also included in this little plan is the fact that an allergy is a life-threatening condition, and it can be anaphylactic for individuals. So if someone has anaphylaxis, it's an extreme allergic reaction that can be life-threatening, and it needs to be managed through administering an EpiPen and calling an ambulance. Whereas if we have a look at an intolerance, it is not life-threatening. The final point that I've made is that an allergy involves complete avoidance of the protein, and even small quantities of the protein cannot be ingested. Whereas an intolerance, the individual can still consume the chemical, but it just needs to be in managed quantities. So if we have a look at this response, which really just brings together everything that we have brainstormed on the previous slide. So this response is going to be an exemplar. So you would achieve 4 marks if you were able to do everything that has been done in the response. And we're really looking at the differences between an allergy and an intolerance and using that language of differentiation. So an allergy is an immune system response whereby the body releases antibodies to destroy harmful proteins in food. So we've included some key SST, immune system, antibodies, and proteins. Now the next point that is really important is the use of that language of differentiation. So alternately, an intolerance is a digestive system response that produces symptoms when the body has difficulty digesting a chemical or group of chemicals in food. So we can see here a key group of differences. Not only is the immune system a difference between an allergy and an intolerance, but also so is the component of food. So for an allergy, it's the protein, and for an intolerance, it's the chemicals. Now, you'll notice that a range of examples have also been included here. So salicylates, amines, and lactose. Those examples of chemicals really showcase knowledge and understanding. So let's continue. An allergy can be life-threatening and might involve anaphylaxis. Therefore, the allergens, for example, milk, egg, and soy, need to be completely avoided. Whereas an intolerance is not life-threatening, and the foods containing the chemicals can be ingested in controlled and managed quantities. So again, we're providing more differences between an allergy and an intolerance. An allergy has been deemed life-threatening, whereas an intolerance is not life-threatening, which is another difference. We've also said the term anaphylaxis, which is a key feature of someone having a severe allergy, and it is not related to someone having an intolerance. We've also got another difference, the fact that if somebody has an allergy, they need to completely avoid the food, whereas if someone has an intolerance, they can still ingest the chemicals in the food as long as it's in a controlled and managed quantity. And we've also got some examples here. So milk, egg, and soy are very common allergens. So as you can see through this exemplar, this addresses the question in detail. The response is detailed, it shows content, knowledge and understanding, but it's also concise, okay? It does not waffle on and provide information that's not relevant. It also does not repeat the question, because when you write the question again, you're not providing any information about your knowledge and understanding, and it is wasting time in an exam. So this is an example of what you could develop to achieve 4 out of 4 in this style of question. So we're now going to look at another question from a past HSC exam. This question says, what is meant by a food challenge? Now, it's out of 2 marks. There's no verb that is in this question. However, we can see that we would need to provide characteristics and features of what a food challenge is. Therefore, we would be describing it because it is a 2 marker. If it was 1 mark, you might just define it. And if it was anywhere between, 3 or 4 marks, then you would be addressing a higher order verb like explain and showing, how and why or the effects of a food challenge. So we're just going to describe the characteristics and features of a food challenge. So some of the key things to remember here is that a food challenge is used to determine if someone has an allergy, and it's used after a skin prick test. And the reason it's used after a skin prick test, which is the initial way of determining if somebody has antibodies and their immune system responds to the protein in the solution that's put on the forearm. And that would result in a large kind of red welt and swelling on the forearm. And that would indicate that the person is allergic to that particular protein. However, if the individual has a series of welts or that it's unclear what the results are of that skin prick test, then they will be, exposed to a food challenge. Okay, so I've just developed a response that would just be an exemplar. So what we would hope to see in students that are achieving 2 marks or full marks in this style of question. So I'll just go through the response. So a food challenge is a method used to diagnose if an individual has a specific food allergy. It is performed under controlled conditions at an allergy clinic or a medical facility to determine specifically which proteins, following a skin prick test, an individual develops an immune response to. Foods are given in a controlled environment, and if symptoms develop, it confirms an allergy. So we can see here that there is enough detail to achieve 2 out of 2. All the content is relevant to the question. It's all very specific, and subject-specific terminology has been used. You'll also notice that parts of the question have been referred to in the response, but the actual question has not been rewritten. So we can see the terms food challenge within the response, but we can also see a lot of other subject-specific terminology. And it's really clear what a food challenge is by reading this response. There's enough detail to show what it actually is. So this is what we're aiming for to achieve full marks in this question. So this is another practice question that does come from a past paper exam. So it says, why is it more difficult to diagnose a food intolerance than a food allergy? And this question is out of 2 marks. So we're seeing here that a food intolerance is more difficult to diagnose than an allergy, and it's asking why. Now, to get the marks for this answer, we really need to be addressing the parts of the food that a person responds to when they have an intolerance versus an allergy. And we know that when somebody has an intolerance, they're responding to a group of chemicals in food, and these chemicals are in a range of different food products. For example, if we look at the example of lactose intolerance, lactose is a milk sugar, and it's not only just found in milk, it's found in a range of other foods as well. So it's found in yogurt, it's found in cheeses, it's found in ice cream. Any dairy products, any milk products would contain the milk sugar lactose. However, with a food allergy, a person is responding to the specific protein in an isolated food. For example, we can look at the protein that's found in eggs, or we can see the protein found in soy or even nuts. The other reason why it is more difficult to diagnose an intolerance is that the onset of symptoms are actually delayed, and it might take several hours before the body would indicate any signs and symptoms. And it can take up to 6 hours at a minimum for these symptoms to develop. So anywhere between kind of 6 and 24 hours, because it does involve the digestive system. And it's not until that chemical reaches the digestive system that the symptoms would begin to develop. However, with a food allergy, because it is an immune response and it does immediately result in showing, those physical symptoms because antibodies have been released, it's very easy to determine if someone's allergic to something because the onset of symptoms is almost immediate. Now, another reason why it's more difficult to determine if someone has an intolerance is that you can still consume the chemicals. For example, if you have lactose intolerance and you're consuming, milk with other foods, the symptoms might be less severe because the body's digesting other chemicals and other nutrients at the same time. And you can have a small quantity of the chemical the person can have a small quantity of the chemical they're intolerant to. However, if someone has an allergy, they can't have even the smallest even quantity of that food. So even a very small quantity will lead to the onset of those symptoms, and it can be quite life-threatening. So these are some of the reasons why it is more difficult to diagnose a food intolerance compared to an allergy. Now, again, this question doesn't have a verb. It doesn't have, describe, explain, outline, identify. But if it's saying why, it is really alluding to that term explain, because explain is when you show how and why, and you show the relationship between two things through cause and effect. So we're going to keep this in mind when we answer this style of question, and we will include an example of cause and effect language within our response to make sure that we are addressing potentially what the markers are looking for. So here we can see an exemplar, which is what you would be aiming to develop for a response in this kind of question in the exam. So let's go through what this says. So intolerances, so we can see here addressing that part of the question. Intolerances involve the body's digestive system having difficulty digesting a particular chemical in food or in foods. And here we can see an example, which is always important to support your response. So this is an example of cause and effect language. Since the symptoms are delayed 6 to 24 hours, and these chemicals can be found in a wide range of foods, for example, again, more examples, milk, cheese, and yogurt, it is more difficult to diagnose an intolerance. So that component of the response there really addresses that question. Also, an elimination diet must be followed compared to a skin prick test for an allergy. And this takes a minimum of 6 weeks versus an instant result from the immune system when diagnosing an allergy, for example, a milk allergy. So we can see here an example of how you would actually diagnose an intolerance versus an allergy and why it is more difficult to diagnose through these different types of tests. So that is what we would be attempting to write for a response in this style of question. Okay, we have another question that does relate to allergies and intolerances. So it is asking you to plan a lunch option using only the foods that are included in an elimination diet. And this is actually out of 4 marks. So we do need to include a fair bit of detail in our lunch option. And we need to have very specific examples of foods, and we need to describe what those foods are. So the way that I would actually start this question is I would just write a quick overview of an elimination diet, and I would say that an elimination diet determines an intolerance in an individual. And then I would go on to actually just have dot points of the foods that could be included as a lunch option. Now you only need to describe a lunch option, so 1. So you would have, for example, the food, the side, and the drink that could be included. So because there are very specific foods that can be included on an elimination diet, your response would need to reflect these foods. So I would have a lamb salad, and in the lamb salad, you would be able to have lamb that has been cooked in a type of oil, and the oil that is allowed on this diet is sunflower oil. And I would also indicate that the salad would contain some lettuce leaves, And on the side, I would have a portion of rice, a portion of white rice that has been steamed. And I would also have some oven baked or oven roasted, thickly peeled old potatoes, because this links back to what is allowed on that diet. So we've got a lamb salad, which is lamb cooked in sunflower oil with lettuce leaves, a side which is a portion of white steamed rice and some oven roasted thickly peeled potatoes. And then I would also have a beverage. So I would say that mineral water could be allowed with some sliced pears to flavour. Okay, so those are the foods that I would include in a lunch menu, and they all reflect what is allowed in an elimination diet.